His best-selling book, Rizal Without the Overcoat, has been in print for the past 34 years. Professor Ocampo once served as president of the City College of Manila, the president of the Philippine Historical Association, co-chair of the Manila Historical and Heritage Commission, chairman of the National Historical Commission of the Philippines, and concurrently chairman of the National Commission for Culture and Arts. His work in public history has been recognized through various honors and awards, the Fukuoka Prize for one, 10 Outstanding Young Men for another, and the Metrobank Outstanding Teacher Award, and he has been also given a Fulbright Senior Research Fellowship. He has been conferred the Order of Civil Merit from Spain, the Order of Arts and Letters from France, and from the Philippines, the Order of Lacandula, the Presidential Medal of Merit, and the Knight Grand Officer of the Knights of Rizal. In another life, he was a Benedictine monk. So this is also a very religious experience for me. You know? And was known as Ignacio Maria OSB. I didn't even know that. Today he moderates all his various, all his various wells of knowledge into his daily columns, into his books, and of course his social media. No? Filipinos, as you might know, there are many Filipinos in the crowd, are very avid followers of social media and of Ambeth Ocampo. My other guest is one of our most beloved writers and one of our most well-known writers, Dr. Jose Y. Dalisay. We call him Butch. He has published over 40 books of stories, plays, and essays, with 7 of those books winning the National Book Award. More than 20 of his screenplays have also been produced as films. In 1998, he was named the Cultural Center of the Philippines Centennial Honors List as one of the 100 most accomplished Filipino artists of the past century. After being imprisoned during martial law for his activism, he graduated from the University of the Philippines in 1984 and then received an MFA from the University of Michigan and a PhD in English from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee on a Fulbright Hays grant. He taught English and creative writing as a full professor at the University of the Philippines and served as chairman of the English department and director of the Institute of Creative Writing at the University of the Philippines. Among his literary distinctions, he was won a lot of many awards, national awards, among them Carlos Palanca Awards, the Cultural Center of the Philippines Awards for Playwriting, as well as various awards from film critic associations and organizations. He was also named one of the 10 outstanding young men, just as Ambeth was, in 1983 for his creative writing. In 2005, he was given the Premio Servaria di Roma in Italy for his literary achievements. In 2007, his second novel, Soledad's Sister, was shortlisted for the inaugural Man Asia Literary Prize in Hong Kong. His novels have been translated into and published in Italian, Spanish, French, German, and US editions, and I believe more. No? He has written the published biographies of several noted personalities and personages from the Philippines, and he has also served at several writing residencies and fellowships, among them Hawthorne and Castle, British Council Fellowships, the David T.K. Wong Fellowship, a Rockefeller Grant, and the Civitella Rainieri Fellowship. He has held the Henry Lee Irwin Professorial Chair at the Ateneo and the Jose Hoya, Jorge Bocobo, and Elpidio Quirino Professorial Chairs at the UP, University of the Philippines. As a writer, he has represented the Philippines in literary festivals and conferences in the US, UK, France, Australia, Italy, and several other countries. I think every country in the world except the moon. He's currently at work on an oral history of the early years of martial law in the Philippines. He collects fountain pens, typewriters, Apple machines, antiquarian books and paintings, and plays poker. So may I introduce our beloved guests, Ambeth Ocampo and Butch Dalisay. My name is Sarge. I'm Angelo Lacuesta on my passport, but people call me Sarge. I'm a writer and a publisher, and I'm very happy and honored to have both of you here. We just had dinner the other day where we had a 3-hour discussion on what we're going to discuss today. Of course, we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about completely different things. But Ambeth, I believe you have something to show us today.
I wanted to start by showing pictures because more than text, people like looking at pictures. So I just have a few slides to put things into context. The whole idea of the haunting is basically that Jose Rizal haunts us 100 years later. And even here in Frankfurt, for next year's book fair, he will still be part of the theme. And so what I wanted to do was to show, especially for the people who don't know who Jose Rizal is, what he looks like. So the picture on the right is his favorite picture that was published after he wrote the first novel. This one was taken shortly before his trip to Germany, and the one on the right is a self-portrait that he made in 1887, so a year after his German trip. I also wanted to show you what his handwriting was like. This is a very interesting letter to one of his friends, which was written when he was in Dapitan during his exile. And as you can see, he wrote in many languages. I think he wrote in different languages because he knew people were opening his mail. So to confound the police reading his mail, he started off by writing in German. And as you can see, my German's very poor, and it's made poorer because Rizal actually writes in 19th century Schrift, which I think even modern Germans will find hard to write. I was told recently that in Japan, many of the doctors studied in Germany, and when they would write, Japanese would write their prescriptions, they wrote in this kind of old German script. So you see here, the first page and a half is written in German, and then suddenly he shifts to English. And then when you turn the pages, it's a 5-page letter. From English, he turns to French. So he writes a bit in French, then he goes to Spanish, and then he ends in Italian, telling the person he's writing to, please write to me in a foreign language because I think I'm forgetting this already. So I'd like to think that here in Frankfurt, a place where we're talking about translation and bringing the literature and writing from all around the world, the whole idea of translation and propagation of ideas you see in the writings of Rizal. He's also haunting us because his first novel was published in Berlin in 1887. His second novel was published in Brussels in 1891. So both his novels and his work of history were all published abroad. So in a sense, again, just like the Frankfurt Book Fair, it is the whole idea of doing things and publishing abroad. I just wanted to show the two novels, actually he described in two different ways. The Noli, and most people think it's just a detail, but I think for the creative writers who are here with me, it shows you something else. No? He described the Noli as a Tagalog novel, and then he described the Fili as a Filipino novel. So I'd like to think it shows the progression of his thinking. Rizal is a person who imagined the Philippines and the Filipinos even before they became what they became. And so I'd like to think that when he wrote the first novel, he was just thinking of his ethno-linguistic group. But by the time he wrote the second novel, he had matured and thinks of the whole Philippines as the nation. Now, the other thing you have to see is, this is we know when he put the last period to the novel. It was done in Berlin in February 21, 1887, 11:30 in the evening, Monday. And he sent the manuscript to the press. He actually drew, this is the hand-drawn cover of the manuscript of the book. And he went to Berlin because it was the place that had the cheapest printing. Couldn't print it in Spain, couldn't print it elsewhere. It was the cheapest. So this actually gives you an idea of what the manuscript looks like. But in the many years I've been studying him, I realized that when I was looking at the actual manuscript, you will see that there are on the margins a number of marginal notes by people. And we know now that the the printing press, this Berliner Buchdruck der Reihe Action Gesellschaft, was actually run by women. Maybe that's why it was cheap. And what's interesting here is we actually see the names of the 4 women who actually typeset the book. They couldn't understand Spanish, but they set the manuscript to type. And these women, Budberg, Leonhardt, Albrecht, and Schultz, are the 4 women who had first read the novel that changed a nation. And it's been one of my on my wish list to find out who they are, what happened to them, and see much more into the writing of the novel. Rizal also, at the time he published the Noli Me Tangere, also translated Hans Christian Andersen tales, 5 of them from German, and he dedicated it to his nephews and nieces. And the original manuscript actually comes with very cute drawings. This is Tambelina, and then this other one says, Ang pangit na sisiw ng pato, the ugly duckling. So, and in this work, he wrote to his nephews and nieces and says, these are stories I hope that will build your character. And sometimes I think he knew that his nephews and nieces could not read the novel, so he gave them 5 Andersen tales to give them something to change and make them as best as they could. Something I've never read, but Rizal actually translated Schiller's William Tell from the original German into Tagalog, and this is the manuscript. And it's quite interesting because when he was talking of translation, he even gave the notes on how to write Tagalog properly. And the way that we write today, half of it comes from Rizal's notes. And he was also interested in the pre-colonial script. So these are the things he was doing, the short 35 years he was in the world. This is a drawing he did when he was living outside Heidelberg. For many years, this was in the National Library of the Philippines. They did not want it published because we cannot have a national hero of the Philippines drawing a farting man. But obviously, this is Rizal and his humor. And he even drew, because I heard yesterday that one of the things that people are interested in Philippines is actually novels and comics. And Rizal is considered the father of Philippine comics because he did this comic book. Well, it's a comic drawing about 2 boys who stole apples. One of them, they crossed a river, one of them fell in, and then they pulled him out. And when I showed this at one talk in Berlin, they said, that's Max and Moritz. And I said, who the hell's Max and Moritz? And it turned out that Rizal was reading these very violent cartoons for children. And so when I looked at it, it's almost copied in that way. So basically, all I want to say is that Rizal is the poster boy for the Philippine participation in the Frankfurt Book Fair. He traveled a lot, and he is, and you should remember this, he was actually a traveler and not a tourist. He talked to people in their languages. He immersed them himself in languages. He wanted to know and be changed by the cultures that he encountered, unlike tourists who stay within their comfort zones and remain the same even after travel. And then I also just want to mention that the Philippines is a strange country because our national hero is actually a writer and a poet rather than a warrior, which says something about the Philippines and its people. And finally, I'd like to think that Rizal's really the poster boy for Frankfurt Book Fair because he was not only an avid reader, he was also an author and he was a publisher. And with this, I'd like to think it contributes to our discussion today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks so much, Ambeth. With every presentation you make, I just learn something new all the time. No, so you could have gone on for 100 slides and it would have been so rewarding. But then you made a very nice point. No? He was a traveler, not a tourist, and that he was a writer and a national hero. He was a national hero who happened to be a writer and a poet. This place, the book fair, is a place for publishers and writers. No? Publishers who sell the work of writers. Butch Dalisay is one of my favorite writers, and I've followed his career avidly also. And I know you're a traveler, no? And I also know that that you embody the idea of a Filipino as a traveler and a writer at the same time. No? And it's been more than 100 years since Noli Me Tangere, since Rizal. No? And one of our dearest friends, Charleston Ong, who is a novelist, has always told me, we all proceed from Rizal, whether we're writers or Filipinos or doing whatever. What are your thoughts about that, being a traveler and a writer yourself?
Well, first of all, the fact that my name is Jose tells you how highly we regard
Was it after Jose Rizal? Really?
Rizal.
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure, but we did have a literary journal named Jose. Of course, it's a very popular name, but beyond the comic aspect of it, as Ambeth was saying, I don't think there are too many other countries in the world where you have one writer who is so influential that his work practically defines the standard by which that country's literature is measured a century after his passing, more than a century. For those of us, by the way, who are not Filipinos and don't know why Rizal is such a central figure in our history, he did not only write these two novels, he died for them. When he came back from his travels abroad, back from a kind of a self-exile, well, he did go into exile in Dapitan, but he was arrested and tried for what he wrote and executed by the Spanish authorities in December 1896. And this was shortly before the Philippine Revolution came against Spain, erupted in full blast the years following. So Ambeth will tell us that not very many people actually read Rizal, but his death helped spark a revolution that ultimately succeeded in freeing us from more than 300 years of Spanish rule. So Rizal is both a terrific writer and also a Christ-like martyr figure to us Filipinos. And because of that, he occupies a very special place in our imagination. In fact, there are cults, religious cults in the Philippines that deify Rizal to this day. But again, given our topic of history and literature, as a novelist writing in the 20th century, I am one of those people who have been acutely aware of the fact that whatever I produce as a novelist will be measured against the two novels that Rizal wrote, and that for better or for worse, Rizal created a template for the Filipino novel, which is that you must write a novel with both breadth and depth. In other words, you could have a love story, but with a revolution in the background, with a cast of characters that represent the entirety of Philippine society, from powerful to powerless, from rich to poor. We have to see all of these elements in this vast and engaging tableau. And so that, in other words, Rizal is a very tough act to follow. And we have spent the past 150 years trying to follow in those great and glorious footsteps. And many of us now ask, should we even be doing this? And should we be looking for other sources of of inspiration. But Rizal will never leave the room, so to speak.
Speaking of haunting, no, the Filipino is actually one of the most well-traveled people in the world. We are one of those, we are natural travelers. No? We are also natural translators. No? If you go to our booth, you'll see books in Filipino, in Tagalog, no? And also in other languages, but also English. No? We're natural translators. So perhaps, Rizal has even had even harder influence on us, an even larger influence on us, more than we think. No? Ambeth, you've been a Rizal scholar most of your life, and you're known for penetrating the very depths, no, down to the details of his life. What do you see in his life that Filipinos cleave to so much, that Filipinos hunger for, or like to reflect on, or like to mirror so much?
Actually, there are two things that came to mind. I was listening to Butch. Number one, which I always tell my students, is that Rizal's greatest misfortune was to become national hero of the Philippines. One, they shot him. Secondly, because he's national hero of the Philippines, we always think about him in terms of being a hero. And we actually forget that he was a writer. So people in schools were forced to read the novels, and we hate it, because we're trained to look for nationalistic, patriotic things. But it is only when you read Rizal without an examination in the back of your head that you will actually realize he was a wonderful, very funny writer. And it is also unfortunate that we only think of him with the man who wrote 2 novels, when he actually left us with 25 volumes of writing that no one reads. Probably only Mr. Castelvi here and me. But when you look at those 25 volumes, you will see those, laundry receipts, lottery tickets, farting man drawings, and many other stories or beginnings of novels that he started and never finished, which hopefully I hope to publish in the volume so that people will appreciate him as a writer. And I'd like to think he should be remembered first as a writer and an intellectual, and secondly as a hero. Changing that mindset, I think, will bring us not just to look for other sources of inspiration, but actually to see in him. I'd like to think that Filipinos see in Rizal their own capacity for greatness. It is, we're crushed by the example, but in it we see how the best that we can be. And that's a hard act to follow.
Interestingly enough, no, we're going to be guest of honor next year, and we just came from a press conference where we presented. In fact, the theme of the our guest of honor status next year is imagination. How imagination peoples the air, which comes from Rizal. No, in fact, we're proceeding very much from Rizal next year. The other thing that strikes me is that there is an internationality to Rizal. He was very much an international man of mystery, I should say, until they killed him back home. But he was always heading home. He was always looking for home. Whenever he was away, we like to think of him as in exile. Is that the Filipino mind?
Well, I think we often talk about the Filipino today as the Ulysses of the modern world. About 1/10 of our population is living and working abroad. All right, that's a huge number. Not just as professionals, of course, but as domestics, as sailors. 1/4 of the world's seafarers are Filipinos. So we are all over the world. And of course, Rizal was a different kind of traveler. He was privileged. He was educated. But I feel that it is these new Rizals, in a way, these new expatriates who will, to some significant extent, redefine the Filipino society of the future. Because I will tell you that almost all of these Filipinos working and living abroad do dream about coming home. And that is the part of us, that is Ulysses. It may take 20 years, but we will come home. And, and when we do come home, we come home with the experience of the world with us. If we see that things work better elsewhere, we will come home with higher expectations and demands of our own society. So there, you know, the Filipino diaspora is both a source of shame and pride. I'd like to think of it as a source of hope for these Rizal-like figures to return home with new liberative ideas, which hopefully they will not get shot for.
Can I add to that lang? Rizal actually foresaw this 100 years ago. He had a friend who had a new son and was being baptized in Barcelona. And he wrote and says, you know, I wish I was there so I can eat lechon and adobo, just as whatever it is you're going to serve, which means that they were cooking Pinoy food abroad. But the interesting thing is towards the end, he says, you know, you hold your baby and you must realize that your baby will grow up in a world that is different from the Philippines. He will grow up free. But the unfortunate thing there is you have created one Spaniard more and one Filipino less. And he says, when I'm in Paris, I hold the one Luna's son in my arms, and I see that he's one Frenchman more and one Filipino less. So it's interesting to see how Rizal actually sees this and how he sees the world. I'd like to think that one of the things that we should do, because in our educational system, we train people to go abroad, to be marketed abroad. And I'd like to think that Filipinos, before they are given wings, should be given roots, so that no matter how far you go, you will always come home. So yesterday, I went around, I was surprised, and I'm going to propose to give a Rizal Frankfurt tour next year, because I find that he actually walks within 2-3 kilometers of the train station. So I followed his route yesterday and was so amused at the things that he saw. He looked at the statue of Goethe in Goetheplatz, and he says it's a wonderful statue, but he looks like a rich banker. He doesn't look like a poet. He went to the Stadel Museum, described the grand entrance. It's made of marble, beautiful. And then he says, in the end, he says, I think the building is worth more than its contents. So he had so many, but the thing, he looks at the main, he looks at, he says, I see this river, it reminds me of the Pasig. I see, he was on the train, and just like any novelist, he's looking at the other people in the train as characters, and then he suddenly says, there's this newly married couple. The man is young, and he's not bad looking, but the woman is old, and she's scarred, and she's ugly, and she has a mustache, and she tries to kiss the I said, you know, he's looking at this, and then he's reminded, it reminds me of someone in Pasig who looks like this woman. No? So when you think of it, his reference is always home. Whatever he sees abroad, he always relates to home. And I'd like to think in the Filipino diaspora, that is what is important. The whole idea of home, the whole idea of going home. And that's when you read the two novels, it's that. It's always the start. It's a person coming home. No? The Noli starts with Ibarra coming home. The Philly starts with Simone coming home, both.
In fact, Ambeth, scholars have pointed out that in Philippine literature, we do have a tradition of what's been called the repatriate figure. The person coming home, presumably from some illuminating or highly educative experience abroad, comes home with these bright, new, reformist ideas, but unfortunately, such characters like Rizal's characters often meet with not just indifference but hostility, and are defeated by the very conditions they seek to reform. But this theme repeats itself in much of our literature. I was surprised myself, having read that essay by Dr. Jerry Burns that, hey, my own novel, Killing Time in a Warm Place, begins with a character coming home uh, uh, to see his dead father. So again, it repeats itself almost subliminally in our literature.
I think the other thing that subliminally happens, which we don't know and we sort of overlook, and you touched on that, Ambeth, that is the storyteller in us.
Yes.
You know, the storyteller who comes home and talks about the things that happened to him,
Yes.
to his loved ones, or to himself, or back to the world. You know, we are natural storytellers, no? And it doesn't even matter what form we use. In fact, we are widely known and infamously known to be one of the largest consumers of social media, but that also makes us one of the largest creators in social media. When we look at social media, we actually read it and we actually write it. So we do create a lot, and I think, and we do complain a lot as well.
Yes.
Wasn't Rizal a complainer at birth? And that potent mixture, I think, is one of the things that makes our nation of thousands of islands so interesting, because we all have our own complaints, and I think our own complaints about ourselves, our complaints toward the authorities, toward whatever the dispensation might be, no? But at the same time, no, we think as a nation because of Rizal. We have a common story as a nation because of him, and that's what made him a national hero.
I'd like to think that maybe one of the themes we could explore, it's a country, it's an archipelagic country with over 7,000 islands and 2,000 rocks, which are big enough to build a house in. So the thing here is, we're an archipelago, we're a nation of stories. And Rizal's always writing stories. When I was thinking about it, you know, if you actually look at the oldest Tagalog dictionary, 1613, and I looked up the word history, history was translated as salita, which today you mean a word. And I was wondering, why is history a word? And then when I was looking at the meanings, the usage that was being done, no? Magaling na salita, a good story, bring me a good story, dalan mo ko magaling na salita. And then I realized, he says, there's one that says, your story has no sense, it has no beginning and end. And then I realized that salita actually means spoken word. We are a nation of oral storytellers. Our great literature is actually oral. And we see that even today. No? Maybe it's not something we should push for Frankfurt, but it's, if you think in terms of a printed word, but in comics, in social media, in podcasting, in song, dance, and in other forms, we tell our stories in other forms. And I'd like to think maybe that is what Rizal is telling us. When he did a novel, he didn't do a Western novel. It's a collection of little stories. It's like a telenovela. Maybe he's pointing out to us that you should not write the novel in the Western form. Do it the way that we do it, in many little stories that lead into something bigger.
In fact, that remains part of our discourse when we talk about literature. No? Yes. What is the Filipino form of literature? No? And many have argued that, yeah, it's TikTok. You know, it's writing a Facebook post that garners tens of thousands of likes and has so much engagement that it may as well be a novel. For example, that is our novel form. In fact, if you look at the root word of the novel, no, you understand that it is something about being of your time, no? Such as Rizal was. No? I'm not trying to explain away the Filipino, because we're going to let our book stand explain itself, no? Explain our own stories to us, and to the world, I suppose, next year. But is this how he haunts us? No? To remain, the ability to remain in their times, despite the dangers that writing something or saying something poses to ourselves.
Well, speaking of those dangers, we Filipinos are, I think, among the world's most expressive people. There is no such thing as a taboo for the Filipino not to talk about. You know, like in certain cultures, and I think you know what I mean, it's said that, oh, you can't talk about politics or religion at the dinner table. That's absolute bunk when it comes to Filipinos. We will talk about politics and religion and sex and whatever else all the time, all right? And that's good, but that also gets us into trouble with each other and with other people. Now, in terms of our writing, we feel free to express what we want to say. However, ironically, those of us who do work with novels, fiction, poetry, we can say whatever we want to say, but we are not, I think, in any real danger of being persecuted, much less executed. I think Rizal was the last Filipino novelist who died for what he wrote.
Thank goodness. Huh?
However, there are other Filipino writers who do die for their work, and these are mainly the journalists. Journalists who work in small places far from the city, who offend the political establishment, and not a month goes by without one of them. And these are not just writers, but radio broadcasters and so on. So that happens a lot. But despite these obvious dangers, we still say what we want to say, which I think is a good thing overall.
It's also an incurable thing, no, to just say something despite the fact that you know you're going to be pilloried for it. No? It happens a lot in social media. You know, I know people are going to hate me for it, but I'm going to write it anyway. I'm going to write it anyway, whether or not I'll regret it.
Yes.
No, or be censured, or you know, be punished for it.
Clickbait.
Clickbait. Ambeth calls it clickbait. But speaking of clickbait, Ambeth, you get 2,000 likes for every post you make, and it's always about a detail. No, it's quite true. No, the reason why I absolutely love that fact is because your posts are not short; they're long. They're stories. No? People read them, and people like them, and people comment on them. And you've received a lot of negative comments as well. And we've spoken privately about how you read them, and you like internally laugh at them. Are we a provocative storytelling culture then?
I think so.
Is that what haunts us? Is that was Rizal knowingly he decided to be a provocative writer, to stir the pot? And sort of say, I'm going to write an angry, it's not necessarily angry. I'm going to write a work that's full of stories that might be a little bit funny, a little bit ironic, but it's going to cause a revolution.
Or actually what he wanted and what we don't see is that he used humor as a weapon. Because he realized, even in the Philippines, when you make fun of someone, that is the most painful thing you can do to them, which is why in the Philippines they call me patola, which is, what's patola in English?
Patola is you indulge
you
your
engage in your
yeah.
trolls.
Yeah.
So what I do is I answer and then I block them. And I realize that one, they cannot make money on me once they're blocked. But second is that when you make fun of them, it's something that they really hate, because they really want you to answer in an angry way. But then you turn it around and you make them look ridiculous. That's the way to deal with it. But it's something that comes with practice. And I think maybe I have too much of a sense of humor to take myself.
But also, I want to think that it also proceeds from Rizal, because he was funny, and that made him quite Filipino. In fact, we have a panel on humor coming up at the end of the week. You know, and there should be many panels, because I like to think that I like to call the panel a jest of honor panel. But seriously, there's a lot of humor in your work, and Butch, in your work, there's a lot of dry humor.
Yeah, well, in my kind of more journalistic prose and the essays, the humor comes out. But I often also do point out that in much of our more novelistic kind of literature, I find actually an absence of humor, which is mystifying given that I think we're one of the world's funniest people. I mean, we make a joke of everything. And part of that is as a maybe a defensive reflex mechanism. I mean, what else are going to do with this crazy world but laugh? No, we see the natural irony in things. And there is a lot of humor in Rizal, which we also kind of retain, like in the figure of Doña Victorina, who looks like she has flour all over her face because she wants to look white. And this is one of the great things about Rizal. We remember details from the Noli and the Fili better than details from the history books. So he's very effective that way. But I think it's the kind of the serious part of the Noli and the Fili that our novelists feel burdened by. We kind of got the natural hero bit, and not the Joker bit, which we should have retained a bit more. But I think in our new literature, a lot of this humor is now popping out. No. We're also iconoclasts, so much as we venerate Rizal, there are many kind of little anti-Rizal impulses out there that are being bred among our younger writers, which I think is a terrific development.
I'd like to think that we invented the meme that is actually, which is, at its heart, it's a joke. And Rizal is such a, I like to think about Rizal's riddles, his buktong, and his short pieces as really pieces of humor. These small nuggets of humor that are really nuggets of wisdom. There's wisdom in our humor, and there's also self-deprecation. But there's also a lot of protest, that happens. We're on our last 5 minutes, and maybe we can invite anyone, if anybody has a question, one or two questions. I saw a sign that says 5 minutes. Was that for us? It was pointed at us. There's nobody else here. Yeah, it's only we want to talk more. But seriously, if anybody has questions, please feel free to raise your hand. You will not get shot here as Rizal was. But I do want to talk about the novel as a form that Rizal chose as a form of protest toward not just Filipinos, but toward the world. He was talking to the world when he wrote it. Why do you think he chose the novel as a form? And this is a question that really hinges on our presence here in the book fair, at the book fair.
No, actually, the books were published abroad, but he realized after writing 2 novels that his people did not read it, which is why he started a 3rd one in Tagalog, a very funny one, totally different from the first 2. And it is unfortunate that after writing 200, the first chapter, he decided it's okay to write a letter in Tagalog or to speak in Tagalog, but to write a novel in Tagalog takes more effort. So he shifted to Spanish and wrote 245 pages, which again was not finished. But it shows you the direction. In the 2 novels, he's talking to people outside. And then suddenly in the end, unfortunately, the things that were never published he was already addressing his own people. And I'd like to think, to close this conversation, the whole talk of a haunting. Rizal is there, he's haunting us in many ways, but a haunting that encourages us to see the Philippines in a different way, for Filipinos to see themselves in a different way. And I'd like to think by his life, by his writing, by his example, Rizal is actually giving us the model. He wanted us to be the best that we can be. And here in Frankfurt, what we have brought is the best that we could be. And maybe that is, the haunting that has been with us for over 100 years, a haunting, I think, that will guide us when we become guest of honor next year at the Frankfurt Book Fair.
I think we should end on that.
We're going to end on this, and we're going to end on this because next year we will be haunting these halls as guest of honor. And I'm actually happy to report that if you pass by our stand at 5.1, if you pass by our stand, you will see just how much our literature has proceeded from Rizal in a large way. There's so many novels, stories, so much poetry, so many funny things now happening in our literature, not just in Spanish, German, and English, but in Filipino and all our other languages, of which we have 180, last I heard. And there are more invented every day. I'd like to thank everyone for coming here. I'd like to invite everyone to pass by our booth and to talk to us. We have a lot of stories to tell. Thank you so much.